Well, thank you, Patty. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people here who obviously care about the humanities, care about history, care about understanding things like this terrible war that happened 100 years ago that still has a lot to do with shaping the world that we lived in today. And I'm just delighted and pleased that so many of you, not just here, but in the balcony as well, came out on a bright sunny day to be inside and to join in a conversation about these things. I think the 100th anniversary of the First World War is a good time to look back on it, to try to understand how it started, why it could happen, what we can learn from it, and how it took humanity by surprise and in so many ways remade our world for the worse. It's a war that has long been a personal obsession of mine, something I've always been fascinated by, for many, many years wanted to try to find a way to write about. The more that I learned about it, the more I realized there were good reasons for being obsessed with the First World War. Military and civilian dead together from that war total about 20 million people, which is 6 times the death toll of any previous war in Europe. So you have to imagine the impact that that had on people living through it. There was an even larger number of wounded, and the war took its direct toll on the continent in many other ways as well. Destruction on the ground beyond anything any other war in Europe had known. Because on both sides of the continent, east and west, as armies retreated, they destroyed everything that could possibly be of use to the advancing army, blowing up buildings, poisoning the wells, cutting down fruit trees, leaving scorched earth behind them. So the war left huge swaths of scorched earth on both sides of Europe. Now, I also confess that I have a personal reason for being fascinated with this war, which is that an uncle of mine fought in it. Here he is with his fighter squadron of the Imperial Russian Air Force. And that's him in the middle of this picture. And if you look closely, you can see that white cross that's dangling from around his neck, about a foot down. That is the cross of the Order of St. George, which was the highest decoration for valor awarded by Imperial Russia. And it entitled the bearer to a private audience with the Tsar at any time of day or night, a privilege that was not much use after 1917. Because, of course, one effect of this war was to sweep away those empires, not just the Russian Empire, but the German Empire. That's Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany on the left, marching in a parade with his 6 sons. Just look at those hats. You know, there is something that they telegraph about the era. This is the Kaiser's wife, the Empress, and her daughter. You can't say nobody has ever worn hats like that again, because you do see them at royal weddings and things like that. But certainly there is something about the elaborateness of this headgear, which to me says something about the imperial self-confidence of the Europe of 1914, an era which the people living through it expected was going to last forever. And of course, it didn't last forever. When the war began, it was founded, as so many wars are, including some that we have lived through very recently, on several illusions. One of them was the illusion of quick and easy victory. These are German students marching off to enlist in Berlin, 1914. Kaiser Wilhelm told them, "You will be home before the leaves fall from the trees." Here they are getting into a railway car to go to the front, and on the side you can see it says, "To Paris." Frenchmen rejoicing with equal enthusiasm as they head off to battle in August 1914, their railway car, and on the side it says, to Berlin. So that was one illusion, quick and easy victory. The second illusion that underlay this war, I can only describe as the belief that you would be shooting at the enemy, but they would not be shooting at you. Again, I think an illusion common to many wars. How else can you explain the color of the uniforms that millions of French infantrymen wore into battle in August of 1914? These are not the dress uniforms. These are the combat uniforms. And they're sort of based on the assumption that nobody is going to be shooting at you looking for targets. They were not the only army of that era that was fond of bright red and blue. The Austro-Hungarian cavalry also loved those colors and didn't abandon them until 1916, 2 years into the war. Another illusion, I think, was that cavalry itself could play a role in 20th century mechanized industrial warfare. All the armies had them. French cavalry here, a British cavalryman here practicing with a dummy for the great cavalry charges that the generals expected were going to really define the course of the war. German cavalry here, Lancers. When the Germans invaded France and Belgium in August of 1914, they did so with 8 cavalry divisions, 40,000 men on horseback. What were they thinking? Well, all of these cavalry generals knew that cavalry had been the major source of military glory, the major decisive factor in battle for thousands of years. It was also the quickest path to promotion because cavalry officers tended to get promoted more rapidly than infantry officers. And they were simply unwilling to let go of that idea. And of course, cavalry, as well as some of those other illusions, came up very quickly against the barrier of barbed wire, not to mention the machine gun, the 2 deadly defensive weapons of the First World War. The result, as you know, is that on the Western Front, the armies very quickly got bogged down into a line of trenches that remained quite static, went from the English Channel, the upper left, to the Swiss border at the lower right, and for more than 3 of the 4.5 years of war, that line barely moved. For example, take the year 1915, a year where in the West the Allies made several large offensives. There were probably more than 1 million men total dead and wounded on both sides on the Western Front. The Allies, in the course of the entire year, gained exactly 8 square miles of ground. And instead of those glorious cavalry charges, men found themselves fighting in an absolutely devastated landscape that looked like this. This used to be a forest in Belgium. On the Western Front, over those 4.5 years of war, there were more than 900 million artillery and mortar shells fired, and this is what they left the land looking like after they exploded. Instead of the illusions that they had, men found themselves living below ground, sharing space sometimes with corpses, sharing space with rats, and they often found themselves fighting knee-deep in mud. They also found themselves up against terrifying new weapons that they hadn't imagined, hadn't planned for, like the flamethrower, or like poison gas, against which they improvised defenses. These are some of the early gas masks, but the defenses often didn't work. These are British soldiers blinded by a gas attack in April 1918. They're keeping their place in line because they can't see each guy has his hands on the shoulders of the man in front of him. Most soldiers who were maimed, wounded in the war, however, were wounded by bullets and shrapnel. And all you have to do is look at one such man and then multiply him in your mind by 21 million, which is the number of people who were wounded in the war. So the effect that all this had on the soul of Europe, on how people thought about humanity, I think was visible even as the war was going on. One of the things we're talking about a lot this weekend is the cultural landscape around the war. And I think you could begin to see signs during the war itself as to how that was changing. This cartoon appeared in a Dutch newspaper in 1917. And I think what it showed was that the era of Victorian optimism, the era where everybody assumed that things were gradually getting better and would continue to do so forever, was over for good. This is a sort of cartoon which never could have appeared a few years earlier. That's just one feature of a much changed cultural landscape. Let me turn quickly to several other aspects of this war, which I think made it quite distinct. One was this: when we think of wars in the United States today, we usually think of them as being fought by the poor. You think about Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Very few children of senators, members of Congress, corporate CEOs took part in those wars. In World War I, it was the exact opposite. The upper classes died in higher proportion to everybody else. Why? Because it was those young captains and lieutenants who led their men out of the trenches and into that hail of machine gun fire. This picture shows cadets at Eton, Britain's most exclusive school, drilling in the School Cadet Corps in 1915. The following year, 1916, there were more than 30 graduates of Eton killed in a single day, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And there's similar statistics wherever you look. Men who graduated from Oxford in the year 1913, 31% were killed. Similar statistics in the French, German, and Russian armies. So the idea that a military career was a respectable and honored thing for a young man from the upper classes, without any imagining of this enormously high casualty rate, was a very ancient idea. It went back for a long time. Many people aspired to it. Rudyard Kipling, for example, Britain's most popular writer, a great lover of all things military, a great supporter of all wars his country was ever involved in, long wanted a military career for his young son, John, who's probably about 4 years old in this picture. John Kipling set his heart on getting into the military, had trouble initially because he'd inherited his father's bad eyesight. You know how the elder Kipling has these very thick glasses in most photographs you see of him. But finally, Rudyard Kipling pulled strings. John was commissioned a second lieutenant in 1914. The following year, at the Battle of Loos, he went into action and was never seen again. His father was absolutely devastated. One more example, also from Britain, of the toll taken on these upper-class families. This is Hatfield House, one of the famous old British country homes. Queen Elizabeth I spent part of her childhood on this estate. It was long the seat of the Cecil family, whose patriarch, Lord Salisbury, was Prime Minister of England for many years at the turn of the century. He had 10 grandsons. 5 of them were killed in the war. Here's one. George Cecil died at the age of 18 in the opening weeks of the war. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith of Britain lost a son in the war. So did his counterpart in Germany, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, the Chancellor. The man in the middle in this picture, General Sir Herbert Lawrence, Chief of Staff of the British Army on the Western Front, lost 2 sons. His counterpart in the French Army, General Noël de Castelnau, lost 3 sons. So part of trying to understand this war, I think, involves coming to grips with the power that these illusions had over men like that, so that they could keep on sending their own sons into battle day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, with an ever-increasing chance that they were going to get killed. Now, another thing that was distinctive about this war, really unlike any in the European experience, although this would not be true if we looked at the colonial world, but in Europe, it affected people in a way it never had before, was that it had a vast effect on the civilian population. In many ways, one of the principal ones of which was that it generated huge numbers of refugees. The ones in this picture are in Russia, where by 1916 there were 6 million people on the roads fleeing the advancing German and Austro-Hungarian armies, 6 million people who had left their homes. More millions of refugees in the Middle East and elsewhere. Same thing on the other side of Europe. The refugees in this picture are Belgians, and one of the things that they were fleeing was the prospect of being turned into forced laborers by their German occupiers. This was something that was happening on a vast scale in both Eastern and Western Europe. As the Germans and Austro-Hungarians occupied land, they forced people to go to work in military industries and so on. Also something new, not in the previous European experience. So many people tried to flee from occupied Belgium across the border into Holland, which was neutral, that the Germans built an electrified fence the entire length of the Belgian-Dutch border. It was electrified at 2,000 volts, and several hundred people died trying to cross it. So the point I'm trying to make is just that the pressures of this war, lasting so long, catching up the civilian population to such a high degree, saw the beginnings of a kind of totalitarian control over the civilian population that was something relatively new. This was the first electrified border fence in Europe, but it would unfortunately by no means be the last in the 20th century. A third distinctive thing about this war was that it was the first propaganda war, where in order to keep people's fervor whipped up for 4.5 years, when they were having ever less to eat, seeing more and more of their sons die, you had to convince them on both sides that this was a battle for civilization itself. Tyler Stovall showed you this poster last night. It originated as a U.S. Army recruiting poster, but was copied by the British, and very much shows the way that both sides sort of demonized their opponents in the war. Both sides also invoked God. This is a German poster, and Christ is saying to the German soldiers marching off to fight here, "Go on, soldier. Fulfill your duty. Christ, the Good Shepherd, watches over his flock," and then the Lord's Prayer, the words of the Lord's Prayer. Posters everywhere. Here's an Australian poster trying to get Australians alarmed about the prospect of a German invasion of Australia, if you can believe that. There was a nasty edge to a lot of this propaganda. If you didn't volunteer enthusiastically, you were letting down the women. You were cowardly. And worst of all, you were effeminate. So there were huge pressures on people to volunteer, be good soldiers, fight for their country. Now, all of this madness in the air is something that has long made me admire a different sort of person, those who had the courage to resist it, whom we too often forget today, because they were there in all of the warring countries. In the United States, the great labor leader, Eugene V. Debs, spoke out very strongly against the war when the United States entered it. Because of this, he was sent to prison. He was still in prison in November of 1920, when he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the Socialist Party ticket. More than 500 Americans became conscientious objectors, refused to fight, were imprisoned by the army, like these two at Fort Riley, Kansas. In Germany, the great radical Rosa Luxemburg and many other people were thrown in prison for their opposition to the war. In France, the socialist leader Jean Jaurès spoke out very strongly and eloquently against the war that he saw coming in the first half of 1914. A week before it began, he rushed to an emergency meeting in Brussels of the leaders of Europe's left-wing parties, and when the meeting was over, he stood in front of an enormous crowd there, and he put his arm around the shoulders of the German Social Democratic leader and said, "Our people will never make war on each other." And because of this, 3 days later, when he went back to Paris, he was assassinated. 3 days after that, the war began. Jaurès' assassin, incidentally, was held in jail during the war, was not put on trial until the war was over, and then he was found innocent because it was judged to be a crime of passion. A legal phrase that has traditionally has been a gimmick that lets men get away with murdering women, but in this case, it was judged to be patriotic passion, and Jaurès' widow had to pay the court costs. Let me turn to a different kind of opposition to the war, which was among men who were drafted to fight and who refused to do so. For various reasons, there were more of them in Britain than anywhere else. More than 20,000 young men of military age who were conscripted into the army in Great Britain refused to go. A great many of them, as a matter of principle, refused also the alternative service that was offered for conscientious objectors, because that could mean driving an ambulance at the front or working in a war industry, and more than 6,000 of them were sent to prison, like this prison, which is in Wandsworth, southwest London. The largest number of people imprisoned up to that point in time for political reasons ever in a Western democracy. That wire netting you can see stretched across the opening there is to prevent people from committing suicide by jumping over the edge. Here's one of those prisoners, a man named Fenner Brockway, who prior to the war had been a newspaper editor. In prison, he continued to edit a newspaper clandestinely, published on toilet paper for his fellow prisoners. It published for a full year before the authorities discovered it, shut it down, put him in solitary confinement on bread and water for the remainder of the war. There were other resistors who were not in prison, at least not at the beginning, but who supported those who were. Bertrand Russell, the country's leading philosopher, was a strong opponent of the war. And in writing about this era, I came very much to admire Russell because he was so honest about the conflict he felt in his own feelings. He wrote at one point that at the start of the war, "I felt tortured by patriotism, for I desired the defeat of Germany as ardently as any retired colonel. Love of England is very nearly the strongest emotion I possess, and in appearing to set it aside at such a moment, I was making a very difficult renunciation." But he felt the war was not worth fighting. It was not a war for democracy. How could it be when one of Britain's principal allies was Tsarist Russia, the last absolute monarchy in Europe? And for his opinions, Russell was sent 6 months in prison. Somebody who also spent 6 months in prison was Britain's leading investigative journalist, Edmund Dean Morell. If any of you have read my book, King Leopold's Ghost, you'll remember him as the man who almost single-handedly put the atrocities of King Leopold's Congo on the world's front pages. He served his sentence at hard labor. It broke his health, and he died a few years afterwards of a heart attack at the age of 51. Now, one of the interesting things about this period for me in Britain, where there were so many resistors against the war, is that there were many families that were divided. For example, and those of you who've lived through the Vietnam War era too remember how much that happened here. This woman, for example, is Charlotte Despard, one of the great radicals of the day, backed independence for India, independence for Ireland, went to jail 4 times in the battle for women's right to vote, became a strong opponent of the war, traveled up and down the country speaking at rallies, which were often broken up by police or by rock-throwing mobs, visited the families of conscientious objectors in prison. Amazingly, her much-beloved younger brother, Sir John French, was commander-in-chief on the Western Front. When I discovered this pair, I thought, now, these are going to be interesting people to write about. And indeed they were, because this brother and sister had diametrically opposed politics, but they were very fond of each other, and they continued to stay in touch throughout the war. And they stopped speaking only in 1918, when the British faced a nationalist uprising in Ireland. They felt they needed a military man with a firm hand to suppress it, so they sent Sir John to Ireland as viceroy. She went to Ireland to work for the IRA, and they stopped speaking. Another strong opponent of the war was a woman named Emily Hobhouse, who did something quite remarkable. In 1916, and unauthorized by anybody, unknown to anybody, she traveled from Britain to France, from France to Switzerland, which was neutral, and from Switzerland into Germany. And in Germany, she went to Berlin and went to call on the German foreign minister, whom she had known before the war. And she started talking peace terms with him. You know, if we did this, might you do that? And if you did that, well, maybe we could do this. Had 2 meetings with him, came away thinking erroneously, I'm afraid, that she had the outlines of a peace agreement Germany might agree to. Went back to Switzerland, to France, to England, tried and failed to see people high in the British government, which was appalled to find out about this trip, and immediately passed laws and regulations making it impossible for anybody to do anything like it, wrote her off as a complete crackpot. But I think she deserves a place in history, because in this war that killed such a huge number of people, she's the only human being, military or civilian, from any country who traveled from one side to the other and back again in search of peace. Here's my favorite British resistor, a man named John S. Clarke. Clarke was born into a circus family in Scotland, and at the age of 17, he went into the ring and became the youngest wild animal tamer in Great Britain. Then he got involved in radical politics. When the war began, he was strongly opposed to it. In 1915, he was tipped off by a friendly policeman that he was about to be arrested. So he went underground, stayed underground for the remainder of the war, writing for and editing an anti-war newspaper, which the authorities kept trying to shut down, but they could never succeed in finding out where it was published. After the war, it was safe for him to surface again. He eventually became a Labour Party member of Parliament, then spent the final decade of his life on the Glasgow City Council, and whenever a circus came to town, he would go back into the ring, and at that point was the oldest wild animal tamer in Great Britain. This is why, by the way, I love writing about the British, because, you know, in this country we have war resistors, we have lion tamers, but we'd never have somebody who was both. So the war that people like this had the courage to resist caused absolutely unprecedented suffering. And it spread across the world. It took place, as Tyler Stovall mentioned last night, on a vast front in Eastern Europe, as well as the much better known Western Front in the West. These are Cossacks in the Russian army. It took place at sea. This is a British freighter being sunk in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of ships were sunk. It spread to Africa and the Middle East. This is an Australian camp at the foot of the pyramids. And it took place in Africa, where each side was eager to seize the other side's colonies. Because so much of Africa was impassable and there weren't good roads, some 2 million Africans were conscripted as porters by the rival armies to carry their weapons and supplies, like some of the guys you can see in this picture. It's estimated that 1 out of 5 of those African porters died, a higher death rate than there was on the Western Front. And still, the war went on and on. By the end, the British were drafting 17-year-olds, and the Germans were putting boys still younger into uniform. And the carnage, nonetheless, continued. And by the time it was all over, there would be more than 9 million military dead, and depending on how you count them or estimate them, somewhere between 9 and 12 million civilian deaths. And of course, that was not the only horrible consequence of the war. Much of what happened later, directly due to the war, was put in motion by the man you can see in this picture on the far right, shown here with his World War I German army unit, who 20 years later led the world into an even more destructive war and into the Holocaust as well. It is hard to imagine World War II and the Holocaust without World War I. They do really have to be considered as a continuity. So my hope is that when we look back on this period, we'll remember not just the politicians and not just the generals, but those who tried to stop the war, even though their efforts were in vain. I still think we can be deeply inspired by them. Now, I'm going to end by doing 2 things. One is to play you some music. It's a song, some of you may know it. It's called The Green Fields of France, written by the Scottish songwriter Eric Bogle, who now lives in Australia. And he says it was inspired by a visit to one of these vast military graveyards, which I'm sure some of you have seen, which spread all across the area of the old Western Front, northern France and Belgium. Probably the largest concentration of young men's graves anywhere in the world. Bogle says he was inspired by seeing the name of an Irish soldier, MacBride, on a tombstone, and the song is addressed to him. And while it's playing, I'm going to show you some documentary film footage from the First World War, taken at the time. But I urge you, listen to the words of the song.
Well, how do you do, young Willie McBride? Do you mind if I sit here down by your graveside and rest for a while 'neath the warm summer sun? I've been walking all day and I'm nearly done. I see by your gravestone you were only 19 when you joined the Great Fallen in 1916. I hope you died well, and I hope you died clean. Or young Willie McBride, was it slow and unseen? Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife lowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Did you leave a wife or a sweetheart behind. In some faithful heart is your memory enshrined. Although you died back in 1916, in that faithful heart are you forever 19? Or are you a stranger without even a name, enclosed then forever behind a glass frame? In an old photograph, torn, battered and stained, and faded to yellow in a brown leather frame. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife slowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Sun, now it shines on the green fields of France. There's a warm summer breeze, makes the red poppies dance. And look how the sun shines from under the clouds. There's no gas, no barbed wire, there's no gun firing now. But here in this graveyard, it's still no man's land. The countless white crosses stand mute in the sand. To man's blind indifference to his fellow man, to a whole generation that were butchered and damned. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife slowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Iron Willie McBride, I can't help wonder why. Do those that lie here know why did they die? And did they believe when they answered the call? Did they really believe that this war would end war? For the sorrow, the suffering, the glory, the pain, the killing and the dying was all done in vain. For young Willie McBride, it all happened again. And again and again and again and again. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife slowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest? Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they play the fife slowly? Did they sound the death march as they lowered you down? Did the band play the last post and chorus? Did the pipes play the flowers of the forest?
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Come out again, please. It almost seems improper to say anything after that moving and wonderful presentation to remind us about the insanity of war. So thank you. And Adam is, of course, still writing. So when you fill out your question cards during the breaks, be sure to ask Adam what he's writing about now, because it will be equally wonderful. Now, we have many sponsors for Humanities West. Some of them have been with us for many years, and we're grateful to all of them, starting with Grants for the Arts, which has in the past given us a sustaining grant every year, and we hope that that good news will continue for us in the future. This program in particular is co-sponsored with the Italian Cultural Institute, which supports us. And last night we had an eloquent personal presentation by the Consul General of Italy, also the Da Vinci Society, and this time the World War I Historical Association, which has a lot of materials out in the back if you would look them over. Also, we are offering a tour to World War I sites. They won't look anything like that, I promise you. The tour is in October, but if you plan to go, you really must sign up before the 1st of July or the tour will get canceled. And I welcome you now to take an intermission, and when we come back, we'll have more to say about some of our sponsors and our longtime patrons, the students and faculty of the Sonoma State. Have a good break.